winter of 1973 came early to Millford, Alabama. By December, the air carried a silence so sharp it could split a breath in two. Frost crawled along window panes, the fields turned white, and even the river slowed to a stillness no one had ever seen before. That night, when the cold deepened enough to stop the current, Lila Mayburn never made it home. She was 16, a choir girl with a voice the town said could calm storms. Her mother waited by the window, watching the snow gather under the streetlight, listening for the creak of the bicycle that never came. Hours later, the search party found it by the bridge. The metal frame shimmered under a crust of ice, one wheel half buried in the frozen mud, the other still spinning softly in the wind, as if it hadn't accepted what had happened. Sheriff Dalton Reed was the first on the scene. He stood there for a long time, his breath fogging the beam of his flashlight, before declaring it an accident. Said the girl must have slipped, maybe hit her head, and been carried downstream when the river cracked again. But no one saw cracks. The water below was frozen solid, smooth as a mirror. By morning, the story had already begun to spread. Some said Lila had been seen arguing with someone near the church earlier that night, a tall figure wrapped in a dark coat. Others swore they'd heard a scream from the bridge, cut short by the storm. The sheriff told everyone to stop talking. He filed his report before sunrise and sealed it by noon. When reporters came from Montgomery, they found nothing left but the frozen bike and the tired eyes of a town trying too hard to move on. Still, the whispers wouldn't stop. They said the sheriff's flashlight had gone out for exactly 13 minutes that night. That when it flickered back on, there were footprints in the snow, 2 sets leading toward the river, but only one coming back. Inside the church, the choir sang through the next Sunday as if nothing had changed. But the notes trembled. Every mother watched her daughter more closely. Every man looked twice at the river when he crossed it. And sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, people swore they could hear a girl's voice echoing under the ice. A song half finished, words carried by the cold. Years later, no one could say why the sheriff closed the case so quickly, or what he saw that made him turn pale before dawn. But those who lived through that night remember how the river looked, hard as glass reflecting the sky like a black mirror. They say it was the first time Millford felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by something colder, something waiting. And long after the ice melted, the bridge still creaked in the wind, whispering a name no one dared to speak aloud. 2 weeks after Lila Mayburn vanished, the woods outside Millford grew restless. Branches creaked in the wind like bones shifting in the dark, and dogs howled for reasons their owners couldn't see. One morning, just before sunrise, a hunter found a boy stumbling through the frost-bitten trees. His name was Jonah Pike. 16, same age as Lila, same choir. His feet were bare, torn and bleeding, his clothes stiff with something darker than mud. When the hunter called out to him, Jonah froze like a cornered animal. His lips moved, but no sound came out. They said he hadn't spoken since that night. Not a word. At the clinic, Sheriff Dalton Reed stood by Jonah's bed as the doctor cleaned his wounds. The boy's skin was cold to the touch, his pupils blown wide like he'd seen something that never left him. When they asked what happened, he just stared at the wall. The sheriff leaned close, voice low, patient at first, then sharper. Still nothing, only silence. Jonah's mother arrived later, her hands trembling as she brushed snow from his hair. "Jonah," she whispered, "please, just tell them where you were." But he looked right through her, eyes fixed on something far beyond the room. They searched his clothes for clues. In his pocket, they found a small silver charm. A cross, half melted at the edges, the same kind Lila used to wear around her neck. The sheriff took it, slipped it into an evidence bag, and told everyone to keep quiet. That night, Jonah scratched shapes into the dirt beside his bed, circles, lines, and what looked like a bridge with something hanging underneath. A nurse wiped it away, but he drew it again the next morning. this time adding a lantern swinging over the edge and a tall figure with no face. The town whispered. Some said Jonah had killed her, that his silence was guilt. Others believed he'd seen the devil near the river and lost his voice to fear. The local pastor visited, praying over him until his knees shook. Jonah didn't blink, didn't move. Only when the sheriff walked in did something change. The boy's hands started trembling, tracing that same faceless figure in the air, over and over, like he was warning them about something. The sheriff ordered him sent to the county home, for his own safety. The townsfolk knew what that meant, a place to hide what no one wanted to face. Weeks passed, then months. The snow melted, and the woods grew green again. But Jonah stayed locked away, staring out his barred window at the fields, waiting for something that never came. People said he hummed at night, low, steady, like a choir note held too long. Years later, the nurses who worked there remembered waking to the sound of scratching, only to find symbols drawn across the floor in dust. A bridge, a lantern, a figure with no face, always the same. The sheriff never spoke of him again. But those who did said Jonah wasn't mad. He was remembering that whatever he saw by the river hadn't ended with Lila's disappearance. It was still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to listen. And if you stood outside the county home on a quiet night, you could hear him through the cracked window, whispering words too soft to understand, the only ones he ever said again. By 1986, Millford had nearly forgotten the river, the girl, and the boy who wouldn't speak. The town had grown quieter, older, paint peeled from porches, and the once crowded Baptist church now stood half empty on Sundays. When Pastor David Marrow arrived that spring, he came with good intentions, a soft-spoken man who believed he could breathe life back into the weary congregation. The roof leaked, the pews were warped, and the old wooden floor beneath the altar sagged like a wound. So one morning, as sunlight filtered through cracked stained glass, he hired a crew to tear up the boards and start anew. The first blow of the hammer echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. Dust swirled in the air, thick as smoke. Beneath the planks, they found a hollow space, a narrow trapdoor sealed with rusted nails and the faint smell of earth. Pastor Marrow thought it was an old storage cellar, maybe for hymnals or coal. But when the workers pried it open, a wave of cold air poured out, sharp and metallic, like the breath of something that had been buried alive. The light from their flashlights fell into darkness that seemed too deep for the size of the church. Inside, the walls were stone, wet and uneven, covered in what looked like old soot. In one corner lay a small wooden chest, its hinges green with rot. When they lifted the lid, they found bones, small ones, arranged neatly beside a pair of children's shoes, their leather cracked and stiff with age. Next to them, wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a silver cross engraved with the initials LM. Pastor Marrow's hands shook as he held it up to the light. "Lila Mayburn," he whispered, though no one had said her name in years. That night, the church elders met in silence. Some wanted to call the police. Others begged him to seal the cellar again, to let the past rest. But the next morning, the sheriff's office arrived. Different faces now, though the name Reed still hung over the door. Files were opened, questions asked. The town began to murmur. Then an old photograph surfaced in the archives, its edges burned. It showed the former pastor, Reverend Cole, standing beside Sheriff Dalton Reed, under the same wooden cross now hanging above the altar. Both men smiling, hands clasped like brothers in prayer. The congregation faltered. Some stopped coming altogether. Others lingered at the back pews, praying with eyes half open, afraid of what their faith had been built upon. At night, Pastor Marrow heard sounds from beneath the floor, the slow, dragging scrape of something shifting in the dark. Once, he swore he heard a faint humming, like the echo of a hymn sung long ago. When investigators returned to examine the cellar, the bones were gone. The shoes, the cross, Everything vanished, as if the earth had swallowed them back. Only the photograph remained, framed on the sheriff's wall, the two smiling men forever frozen in the light of a faith that no longer felt holy. And from that moment on, no one in Millford could pray without wondering who, or what, was truly listening beneath their feet. By 1998, Millford was barely a dot on the map. A town swallowed by weeds and memory. The church still stood, its paint blistered, its bell silent, but the sheriff's office had long since closed. Files boxed and forgotten in a dust-choked basement. That's where Claire Duval found it. An evidence box misfiled under unresolved animal deaths. She was a young reporter from Birmingham, chasing small stories for the county paper. But something about that label drew her in. The box was damp, its cardboard soft with rot. Inside were a few photographs, a rusted badge, and a cassette tape crusted with mold. On the label, written in shaky ink, March 12, 1973, confession. She took it home that night, cleaned it carefully with a cotton swab, and slid it into her old tape player. The sound began with static, a hiss like rain falling through wires. Then came the voice, weak, rasping but steady. "This is Sheriff Dalton Reed," it said. The air in Claire's apartment seemed to thin as she leaned closer. He coughed, then whispered, "A debt paid in blood, a ritual under the cross, and the girl who wouldn't drown." There was a pause, then the faint echo of something, not speech but a hum, distant and hollow, as though another voice were trying to form beneath his own. Claire rewound the tape, listening again. Each time, she caught a new phrase between the distortion. She was chosen. The water wouldn't take her. We sealed it under his house. The words clung to her like cold breath. She played it until dawn, scribbling notes that made less and less sense the longer she listened. When she brought the recording to a university lab in Montgomery, the technicians confirmed it. The tape was genuine. The voice matched archived samples of Dalton Reed from the early 70s. No edits. No tricks. That same week, Claire drove to Millford to find the sheriff's widow. The old house sat at the edge of town, its porch sagging under vines, windows covered in grime. A neighbor said Mrs. Reed hadn't been seen in months. Claire knocked anyway. No answer. She returned 2 days later, only to find the house reduced to ash, fire trucks parked in the mud, smoke still curling from the debris. No sign of the widow. No sign of the tape. The fire chief said it was likely caused by faulty wiring. But Claire noticed something strange in the wreckage, a photograph half-burned, the image barely intact. It showed a man standing by the old bridge, snow swirling around him, his face blurred but his smile clear. Claire kept a copy of that photograph in her apartment. She stopped sleeping soon after. She said she heard the tape even when it wasn't playing, the sheriff's voice murmuring in the corners, his cough echoing through the static. 2 weeks later, she vanished on her way back to Birmingham. The tape was never found again, but locals swear that on cold nights, when the wind passes over the river, you can hear her car radio picking up a signal, faint, crackling, and repeating the same words over and over. The girl who wouldn't drown. By 2001, Millford had almost faded from memory. Most of the old families had moved away, leaving behind hollow houses and cracked gravestones. Only the church remained alive, held together by the will of one man, Reverend Samuel Harlow. He was the kind of preacher people trusted without question. He married their children, buried their dead, blessed their harvests when the rain came late. His sermons were soft and slow, the kind that made people close their eyes and breathe. To the town, he was the last good thing left, until the DNA results came back. The state reopened the cold case that spring, using new technology to test the evidence collected decades before, the fragments of bone, the traces of blood found beneath the church. When the report arrived, it named a single match, Reverend Harlow. The shock hit Millford like lightning. The man who had baptized generations, who spoke of forgiveness and grace, was led from the chapel in handcuffs under the grey morning sky. his white collar still around his neck, his Bible tucked beneath his arm. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting prayers and curses all at once. Some cried, others demanded proof. But Harlow never flinched. His calm smile unsettled even the deputies who guarded him. "I've done nothing wrong," he said. "I only kept the covenant alive." No one understood what he meant. Not then. Inside his home, investigators found rooms lined with journals, hundreds of them, filled edge to edge with prayers written backward, letters looping into symbols no one could translate. On one wall hung sketches of a tall, faceless figure standing beneath a bridge, a lantern in its hand. The same image Jonah Pike had drawn 28 years earlier. Reporters flooded the town, turning Millford into a spectacle. Old residents came back to testify, their faces hollow with unease. They remembered how the Reverend always spoke of sacrifice, how he'd warned that faith must be fed to stay alive. When the prosecutor asked him about the bones beneath the church, Harlow only smiled and said they were never mine to bury. During the trial, the evidence was laid out in full view, the cross engraved with LM, the charred photograph, and the audio transcript of the sheriff's confession. The courtroom fell silent when Harlow began to hum softly under his breath, the same hymn once sung by the choir the night Lila disappeared. Some said the lights flickered then, others swore they felt the air drop cold enough to see their breath. He was convicted on all counts. But when the verdict was read, his smile never left. As deputies led him away, he turned to the crowd and whispered, "You still pray to it. Every Sunday. You just don't know its name." That night, the church doors swung open on their own. The bell rang 3 times, though no one was inside. And by morning, a single line of footprints appeared in the frost, leading from the chapel to the river, ending where the ice used to break. The horror hadn't left Millford. It had simply changed its face. 50 winters have passed since Millford's last prayer was spoken aloud. What remains of the town lies buried under vines and dust, houses slumped into the ground, the church a hollow skeleton, its steeple leaning like a dying sentinel. Only the river still moves, carving its way through the woods as if searching for something it once lost. In the dead of winter, when the water freezes solid, it becomes a mirror of pale blue glass. That's when the visitors come. Not the faithful, just wanderers and urban explorers chasing ghost stories. They bring cameras and flashlights, laughing softly to mask their unease. But when they look down through the ice, their laughter dies. Because there, faint and pale as breath, are faces, dozens of them. Some childlike, some aged, all watching from beneath the frozen surface. The recordings began to circulate online, grainy and shaking in the cold. At first, people thought it was a trick of light. Reflections, ice patterns, pareidolia. But one video captured more. The cameraman's voice breaks mid-sentence when the ice begins to hum, low, steady, like a voice buried deep in the current. Beneath it, faint shapes seem to shift. A girl's outline near the bridge, a boy's shadow by the shore, a man standing between them, holding something that glints like a lantern. Locals stopped going near the river after that. They said it remembered every secret ever given to it, and that it was done staying silent. When federal archivists reopened the sealed Millford files, most of what they found was unreadable, papers warped with mold, photographs stuck together by age, but the DNA samples remained intact. The team sent them for retesting using modern analysis, expecting nothing new. What came back stunned everyone. The genetic code from 3 key samples, Lila Mayburn, Jonah Pike, and Reverend Samuel Harlow, showed identical mitochondrial patterns. Impossible, they said. No shared lineage, no connection. And yet, every strand whispered the same truth. They came from the same blood. The scientists blamed contamination or clerical error. The locals didn't. They said the covenant bound them long ago, that Millford had always been one body wearing many faces. As word spread, researchers, journalists and thrill-seekers came to the ruins. Some swore they found signs near the church, markings carved into the stone, like the ones Jonah once drew, looping circles around a faceless figure. One historian claimed the symbol was older than the town itself, traced back to a regional sect that practiced the offering of reflection, a ritual meant to preserve the spirit of a community through shared suffering. But his notes ended mid-sentence, and he was never seen again. Each year when the first frost returns, the river seals itself in silence once more. The explorers who film there now say the faces have multiplied. One frame shows a woman's profile that matches Claire Duval, the missing reporter. Another shows a child no one can name, her mouth open as if mid-song. Locals no longer doubt. They say the river doesn't just hold memories, it feeds on them. That every voice swallowed by Millford becomes part of its frozen choir, waiting for spring to thaw the silence. And when the ice melts, the water sings. It moves slow, carrying whispers through the reeds and stones, calling softly to whoever listens too long. The town's gone now, erased from maps, swallowed by roots. But sometimes, at dusk, when the last light touches the river's surface, the water ripples as if something beneath it is breathing, and a voice rises with the wind, gentle, pleading, familiar. The girl who wouldn't drown, the boy who wouldn't speak, the preacher who smiled through judgment, all one voice now, asking the same quiet question. Millford never answered. Will you keep the covenant alive?